So today's topic is Fettuccine Alfredo, and I'm going to be making the classic Italian version of this dish, and I'm also going to be making the Americanized version as well. They are very similar to each other, but there are a few small differences between the two. And I will also be covering how this dish gained its popularity and notoriety not only in Italy, but also in the United States. So with that, we've got a lot to do here, so let's get to it. So obviously the first thing we need for Fettuccine Alfredo is, well, fettuccine. And I'm using the packaged stuff today because those fancy pasta rollers that big YouTubers use are a bit out of my price range. So for this stuff, start by filling a sauce pot with some water, but don't use too much here. Use just enough to cook the pasta while still allowing for comfortable circulation. So toss in a pinch of salt, and while that heats up, let's get the rest of our ingredients ready. And the only ingredients we're going to use for this version are Parmesan cheese and butter. So for the Parmesan cheese, I am going to use the smallest side of my box grater, and while I usually avoid this side like it's a plate because as you can see it's a legit pain in the ass, the finely grated cheese is actually ideal here because it works into the sauce much better in the end. And because I started with just under 2 ounces of dry pasta, which is going to produce 4 ounces of cooked pasta, I'm going for roughly 1 ounce of cheese here. And for the butter, I'm going to use 4 tablespoons, which equals 2 ounces. So the ratio we're using here is 4 ounces of pasta, 2 ounces of butter, and 1 ounce of cheese. And it's important to cube up the butter here into roughly 1/2 inch chunks, and that will end up making a little bit more sense here shortly when we put the final dish together. And back over at the stove top, the water has reached a boil so we can toss in our pasta, and because it's a long strand form of pasta, it's important to stir it up in the early stages so that the strands don't stick together. Some people will suggest adding oil to prevent this, but that doesn't really work because it never really blends in, rather it just sits at the top. Okay, the dish that we're preparing right now is known as Fettuccine Al Burro, or fettuccine with butter. And obviously dishes that are comprised of pasta with butter or fettuccine with butter have been around for centuries. And even here in the United States, there is a version quite similar to this that predates this, but I'll come back to that here in a few minutes. Right now we need to figure out how this dish gained its notoriety. And that probably happened in 1908 when a chef by the name of Alfredo Di Lelio prepared a dish for his wife that consisted of pasta, Parmesan, and butter. And I've read accounts that said that his wife was pregnant at the time, and I've also read other accounts that said she had just recently given birth, so I'm not really sure on that because obviously I wasn't around in 1908, nor have I been to Rome where this happened. So your guess is as good as mine on that one. But a few years later, he opened up a restaurant in 1914 in Rome called, of all things, Alfredo. And shortly after this, he also began serving this dish on his menu. And traditionally, this was a tableside preparation. And this probably contributed as much as anything to the popularization of this dish because this was a whole show that he put on, and he kind of became famous for doing this. Okay, jumping back into it, the pasta is done cooking now so we can strain it out, but you'll notice that I've placed a measuring cup inside the strainer, and that's because I want to collect some of this cooking water which is going to be used to help bring the sauce together. The pasta water contains starch which helps emulsify the sauce and add stability, which is why I mentioned earlier not to use an excessive amount of water when boiling the pasta. And while I mentioned that this dish was originally put together tableside, I'm going to do it over the stove top because that's more practical for myself, and I would imagine it's more practical for most others as well. So after combining some of the pasta water with the pasta, add roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the butter chunks, and you want to make sure to do this over low to medium heat. If the heat gets too high, the butter will break and separate into an oily, curdly mess, and that's not what you want here. Continue to stir and toss everything together until the first round of butter has melted, then add the remaining cubes of butter left over. And you can choose to do this in either 2 or 3 increments, but the idea remains the same: to watch the heat and gradually melt the butter while using the pasta water to help maintain the consistency. And once all of the butter has melted, we can begin adding the cheese, and you want to do this incrementally as well, because if you add it too quickly it will all clump together and it will be really hard to work it all back out. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but the Italian version Fettuccine Al Burro does not contain cream. Rather, adjustments in consistency are done solely with the pasta cooking water. And I'd say this is looking pretty good right here, so I'll go ahead and plate this one up and give it a try. Well, that's literally it for this version version of pasta al burro. It's a very simple dish, it only has a couple of ingredients, and it's really easy to make. But honestly, for most people's taste buds, this dish might be a bit over the top because it is really buttery and really cheesy. And that's probably the case for me as well. I'm more used to the Americanized version of it, which is quite similar, but it is a little bit toned down from this version. Okay, on to the American version of this dish, which is known as Fettuccine Alfredo. But first I want to go over a brief history of mac and cheese because it does tie together a little bit. In the 1780s, Thomas Jefferson served as the minister to France, and while he was there, his enslaved chef James Hemming learned a baked dish that was comprised of pasta, butter, and Parmesan, and this is perhaps the first rendition of macaroni and cheese here in the United States. And this does predate Alfredo by over 100 years, and the ingredients are quite similar. But how did this particular dish known as Fettuccine Alfredo catch on here in the United States? Obviously, many travelers went to Rome because this was sort of a tourist attraction going to Alfredo's restaurant. And among these tourists were a few very popular silent film actors of their time, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. In fact, Douglas Fairbanks was the original Zorro and was known as the King of Hollywood, and Mary Pickford was known as Queen of the Movies. And these two often ate at his restaurant when traveling to Rome. And also during this time, many publications wrote about Alfredo and the whole tableside presentation and the entire show that he was putting on. And here in the United States, a couple of decades later in the 1970s, his son opened up a couple of locations, one in Rockefeller Center and the other one at Disney World in Florida. And to my knowledge, both of those are now closed. And in the 1980s, the two largest Italian restaurant chains in the United States opened up, one of them being the Olive Garden, the other one being Carrabba's. And regardless of what your thoughts are on these two particular establishments, they undoubtedly contributed to the popularity of Fettuccine Alfredo. Okay, for this version, which does contain cream, I've come up with a really easy ratio that works perfectly every time, and that's 2 parts dry pasta and 1 part for everything else. So for the recipe today, it's going to be 4 ounces of dry pasta and 2 ounces of Parmesan, 2 ounces of heavy cream, 2 ounces of butter, and 2 ounces of pasta water that we'll be collecting later on. And the first half of the Fettuccine Alfredo recipe is pretty much the same as the Fettuccine Al Burro. Boil the pasta until it is al dente, then strain it out while harvesting some of the pasta water, 2 ounces to be exact for this recipe today, but it doesn't hurt to grab a little bit more just in case. Strain out the rest of the pasta and add the pasta water to a slightly preheated pan along with the pasta and 2 ounces of heavy cream. Add a pinch of salt, then reduce the liquid slightly to thicken it up a little bit. Then you can start working in the butter, and while the cream will help give the butter a little bit more stability as far as it potentially breaking and separating, you still want to do this gradually in 2 to 3 increments. And once you've got all of the butter worked in, it will still be slightly on the runny side, but the cheese will balance all of that out and bring everything to the right consistency. So when it comes time to add the cheese, just as with the previous recipe, do it gradually and do it over low heat. Melting cheeses have a tendency to kind of want to clump together, and that's probably the biggest issue that people might encounter when making these recipes or a macaroni and cheese or any dish like this. And since we're arriving at the right consistency now, one thing that's popular with American style Fettuccine Alfredo would be add-ins, and for me that means roasted broccoli and chicken. So to make roasted broccoli, toss some broccoli pieces with a little bit of olive oil along with a pinch of salt and optionally black pepper, and place the tray into a preheated 400-degree oven for 8 to 12 minutes. And you're not looking for a deep dark brown here because it can take on a bit of a bad texture when you cook it too long. Rather, you just want a lighter brown like you see here. And for the chicken, season 1 chicken breast with salt and pepper and saute it until both sides are golden brown and it reaches an internal temperature of 160 degrees. And hopping back over to the Alfredo, go ahead and toss in the roasted broccoli, and since I like tomatoes too, I'll go ahead and add some of those as well. And for good measure, why not a little bit of finely chopped parsley? And with that, this is looking pretty good, so what do you say we get this thing plated up? Grab a bowl or plate of your choosing and fill the whole thing up with this delicious Fettuccine Alfredo, and finally top the whole thing off with the sliced chicken breast. Well, that's it for the American version of this dish that's known as Fettuccine Alfredo. And I realize that it's kind of a trendy thing within certain circles or, food elitist people to claim that you like the original over a modern American version of a dish. But honestly, this is what I'm more familiar with, so I prefer this one. I don't exactly understand how street cred works with those people, to be honest. But I'll let you decide for yourself. Go ahead and make both of them and let me know what you think in the comments. But for now, we've reached the end of the video, so as always, thanks for tuning in and we'll see you next time.